Welcome to Focus Washington. I'm Chuck Conconi, and my guest today is Joel Payne, who was director of the African American paid media and advertising for the Hillary Clinton campaign. Thank you for being here today, Joel.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
Well, one of the first questions is, what happened that Secretary Clinton was not as successful in attracting the African American voters as President Obama had been?
Well, Chuck, I think the first issue was there was always going to be a lag in excitement from African American voters. Our polling told us that voters were feeling just a less than enthusiastic way about themselves because the fact that they weren't going to get a chance to vote for President Obama after 2 consecutive elections. So that was one. But two, there were real core issues that African American families were feeling that they didn't feel like anybody was addressing. They didn't feel like anybody was addressing the economy. We know some of the things that happened in terms of racial and social injustice issues. So we knew that African American voters were feeling frustrated. We built out a program to address that, and I do think that we did have some successes and some high points, but obviously you always want to do better.
But even in light of the fact that President Obama told voters, black voters, African American voters, that he would consider it a personal insult if his base did not support Clinton, why did they ignore his plea?
I don't know if they ignored his plea. I think if you look at some of the numbers, particularly as all of the numbers have been computed, the weeks that we get away from the election, I think African American turnout actually held up pretty decently. We did come in a couple percentage points below President Obama, but again, that was expected. It was within our win number. But look, there is a phenomenon going on here where President Obama's coattails only reach but so far. It does seem like President Obama's impact is really limited to when he is on the ballot. There is something about him not being on the ballot that creates a little bit of a challenge. Voters respect him, they admire him, but if he's not on the ballot, there is a bit of a drag effect there, and he doesn't have quite the coattail effect that you'd hope.
Well, what were the challenges presented by the campaign that Trump ran?
Well,
especially for African American voters.
Well, now President-elect Trump did target African American voters in ways that, frankly, we haven't seen Republicans do in the past. He directly called out African American voters. He famously said, "What do you have to lose?" And I think that just as a political observer, that was a smart play. I will say, however, I do think folks are overestimating his impact in the African American community. The one place in the African American community where he did have an impact, I think, was with African American men. Probably one of the most stark numbers that I've seen in terms of exit polling is that 80% of black men supported Hillary Clinton, which on the face of it is a good number, but that really means that 1 in 5 black men either voted for President Trump or voted for a third-party candidate, and that's a number that's a little bit lower.
Well, was there something in there where they were saying, we're going to show them, they're taking too much consideration that we're going to go in their direction?
Here's what we found, Chuck. We found that the more, I would say, the more male, the younger, and the less educated African-American voters got, the less likely they were to support Hillary Clinton. In other words, the position that was strongest for Hillary Clinton, the group within the African American community that was strongest were African American women, by far among any voting bloc, white, black, Hispanic, etc. The group that we always found was the softest among African American voters were young, less educated African American men. Frankly, men who President Obama was able to get out effectively 4 years ago and 8 years ago, we struggled to get out this time around.
Will Donald Trump, the president, will he address the concerns of African American voters? Do you feel that way?
Well, look, we certainly hope so, and we certainly want any of our presidents to be successful. But just looking early on here, we're a couple of weeks out, and some of the choices that we've seen made have been, frankly, disturbing. I mean, Jeff Sessions as Attorney General does not seem consistent with some of the things that he said about believing that African Americans deserve different opportunities. It frankly seems consistent with some of the things that we were saying about the risk of a Trump presidency. You look at some of the other picks too; they've been concerning. So there is a big concern, I think, within the African American community about what effect President-elect Trump will have. I think the good news is that you do still have an active group in the Senate that can counter some of President-elect Trump's initiatives if we feel like that minority voice isn't being represented. And we know that politics is cyclical. There's an election in 2018. There's an election in 2020. 2 years or 4 years come pretty quickly in politics. So,
well, this was a very angry campaign. You must have learned something from it. And when you mentioned the election in 2018, will you be able, the Democrats and particularly African Americans, be able to sit back and say, we're going to change things now? Or is it too soon to predict that?
You know, it's very soon to predict it. And I've heard a lot of talk about Democrats not having a deep bench. There are some really talented people on the Democratic side, but you have to let things play out. I think the party could go one of two ways. Either we could overcorrect and say, hey, we weren't progressive enough, let's go for an Elizabeth Warren, or let's go for someone from that wing of the party that's going to maybe a Bernie Sanders even, maybe in 4 years. I think you could kind of moderate as well. The proxy wars that we've seen over the DNC chair election with Keith Ellison and some of the other candidates out there, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So, the short answer is I don't know. And
are you at all
I think
optimistic, though? Are you at all optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic that Democrats are going to come back. I worked in Congress in 2006. And I saw how quickly things can change. There wasn't all that long ago where George W. Bush was president and they controlled Congress and they controlled the agenda. And 2 years later, Democrats came in and they took over Congress. And then 2 years after that, President Obama came in. So things can change very quickly. And if past is prologue, then I think we could be in for another sea change very quickly as well.
Joel Payne, thank you for being here with me today. I'm Chuck Coney, and this has been Focus Washington.